I did a
Good morning, everybody.
solo panel.
Okay. Today is April 6th, 2016. It is 11 o'clock. This is Male Socialization, a Key to Reducing Violence, panel number 3315. That's for the recording. So we have some pretty impressive and fascinating panelists here who you might have seen in other panels today. My name is Alexis Halkovic. I will be your moderator. Okay, I'm hearing an echo, so I apologize. Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. Okay, I am a doctoral student in social psychology at the City University of New York. I'm studying women's vulnerability and the strategies they use to resist, specifically focusing on women's self-defense and gun ownership. I'm very excited to introduce this panel. I'm going to start. Our first speaker is going to be Adam J. Schrager. Adam has been a longtime reporter and is also in the process of raising one son and two daughters. Sorry about the technology. And is trying to figure out how to parent. He has decided that self-help books are of absolutely no help. Sophie Karasik is one of the founders of End Rape on Campus. She's also their director of education. And Rob Warden is a co-founder of the Center on Wrongful Conviction at Northwestern University. He's now emeritus, and he has also started a new investigative journalism organization called Injustice Watch. And finally, Francesca Grifo has survived getting two sons into college, and in her spare time, she saves the environment. Okay, so I'm looking forward to hearing from them. We are in a smart room where you can text in your questions. Currently, I do not have access to that computer, but in the event that we do, I will give you the instructions for how to submit those. Audience questions will be submitted via text. This trial format is motivated by a desire to allow our online audience to participate in the Q&A period and by a desire to improve the overall quality of the Q&A period at the CWA. To participate in text question submission, you first need to join the session. In fact, if you think you might ask a question, I'd encourage you to take out your phone now, and then to join the session, send a text message to the 5-digit number 37607. It's on a panel over there and over there as well, if you forget or you decide to join later. 37607. Again, it's on these two posters on two sides of the room if you decide you want to join. In the body, so then you're going to get a message back. Then you're going to need to reply UMC 235. Again, illustrated nicely on the panels. Then you'll get a confirmation panel, and you're part of the session. So then you just reply with the message that you want to submit with your question. If you're a student, please note this on your question. If you would like your first name and your location to be read aloud, please include this information as well. If you do not have a cell phone, please get the attention of a producer. There's two of them in this room, and they will give you an index card to write down your question. Okay. Oh, and finally, if you are already logged into another session from another room, you need to log out of that session by typing leave. And when you're finished with this session, you will need to do the same thing. Okay. So without further ado, I'm turning it over to Adam.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having us and coming to this panel today. This panel, unlike any of the others that I've been asked to participate on over this week of the Conference on World Affairs, really kind of vexed me because I was curious as to how and why I landed on this panel. So, for example, I was on a Title IX on challenges on college campuses at the start of the week with Sophie, and I covered the case here in Boulder with the attorney Bain Kerr, who's here, one of the first Title IX cases filed as a result of a sexual assault and the reaction of a university back in 2004. I was on a panel dealing with tough love for aspiring writers. As an author, I've been rejected an awful lot, so I could relate to that pretty directly. I was on a modern corruption panel, and I've covered politics for 25 years. I'll let you make the connection right there. But this panel really had me thinking, and when I saw it, I've really struggled in many ways to kind of come up with some sort of a coherent message to share with you today. And I'm going to separate the panel title and talk about male socialization, and then I'm going to talk about violence. And you can maybe see a nexus between the two, and we can have that conversation going forward. To give you a little background about me and how this relates, and kind of the first thing that I thought of, I've been a reporter for 25 years. I love what I do. I meet extraordinary people every day who describe themselves as ordinary, and that makes them even more extraordinary. I was at the pinnacle of my career 5 years ago now at 9 News in Denver. I'm not sitting up here as an apologist for my industry by any means, so we could have that conversation about television news offline if you want. But in the field, KUSA Television 9 News is basically like the New York Yankees of local television journalism. I had access as the political reporter. I interviewed in the 2008 election President Obama 4 times. I interviewed Senator McCain at that time 5 times. They were on a first-name basis with me. That's the kind of access that I had as a reporter at the #1 station in the state of Colorado in the Mountain Time Zone, and arguably one of the best, if not the best, local television station in the country. And I walked away. And I did so, I'll never forget it, the last time that I talked to the president. I left the Roosevelt Room in the White House and went outside and accepted a job with Wisconsin Public Television for 2/3 of a pay cut to move back to Madison to raise my kids closer to grandparents and aunts, uncles, and cousins. Thank you. There were not a lot of people applauding that decision that I ran into when I first made it. And there were a lot of questions about, well, you can fly there. You could see them back in the Chicago area. You could see your in-laws in St. Louis. There are ways to get there. You can build that relationship. And yet, to my wife and I, we felt it was the best decision for our family. And yet, as a man in today's society, you're so conditioned to push for stature and for power and for money that even the question of why one would walk away being raised, and I've had multiple conversations with my wife about this. I don't know that anybody would have asked her that same question. I don't know that anybody would have made the kind of qualifications to her. Well, you could fly, and back and forth. Anyway, I actually, as I now look back, had a model for this. And Rob knows my father well. They're both lawyers in the city of Chicago. And my father started a law firm in Chicago with 2 other lawyers. And when he walked away as a named partner, there were 150 lawyers. He was at the top of his game as well. And I was just entering high school. And in the 5 years since I made this decision and the time leading up to it, he and I have had many conversations about this. He had to deal with the same questions that I did. 40 years later, I'm answering the same exact questions that he did, and I'm wondering to myself, what have we learned from this? And now that I'm back in Madison and I have more time with my family and I have more time with my kids, I'm now a playground volunteer. So every Friday, I go and I monitor the grade school playground at Franklin Elementary School in the city of Madison, in Madison Public Schools. And the day before, a couple of days before my first assignment, I was sent by email a 7-page guidelines for how to be a playground volunteer. There have been NASA, or rather NATO peacekeepers that have gone in with less direction than I received. But what I've learned anecdotally from watching, and I have a 3rd grade daughter, a 1st grade son, and a 4K is what we call it there, a preschool daughter. And what I've noticed in my time on the playground, where I try to stand very official looking and wear an orange vest that makes everybody official looking, apparently, who wears it, is the interaction, and when there are problems on that playground, when it's boy to boy, it tends to be physical, and it tends to end quickly. And there's little in the way of kind of lasting concern between those boys. Whatever happens at that moment, it happens, and then by the end of recess, they're back playing together. With girls, it seems to be more verbal and biting and lasting. And I'm not an expert on behavior. I mean, I should turn to you on this. I don't know why this is the case, but it seems, and this has played out in front of me time and again over the last couple of years that I've been going there. If you've driven up from Denver today, and now I'm going to segue, I think, a little bit to more of the violence side of things. There is a billboard that was just put up in the city of Denver by the Denver Police Department, I believe the Denver DA's office, which says, "Start by believing." There are no crime victims in this society like sexual assault survivors. Because for whatever reason, as a society, we don't start necessarily by believing them. And this also I don't quite understand. I don't get it. And yet there seems to be a scrutiny and there seems to be a focus and a disbelief rather than a belief right off the bat. And Sophie will be able to speak to this obviously more directly. I wanted to share with you a story from my reporting because I've covered a lot of these sex assault stories, sadly, in the course of a 25-year career. And the one I'm going to share with you deals with a young man and a young woman. The young man was the Wisconsin State High School Football Player of the Year. He was a recruit at the University of Wisconsin and was in Madison on his recruiting weekend. And everything I'm telling you here came out in court testimony, so I'm not sharing any kind of confidence that I've had with sources on either side of this case. I'm just going to share with you the facts. So what came out in testimony, I'll back up. He was in Madison on his official recruiting weekend. He is given alcohol by his player host, and he goes to the dorm room of a young woman that he met and knew from high school, and he sexually assaults her. Now, the testimony that came out during this trial, depending if you just sat in on one day, say the prosecution's day or the defense's day, you would have completely 180 descriptions of what this young man was like in high school. For the prosecution, he was a serial offender, somebody who had abused women through the years in high school who just had not come forward and shared their story. But now, after this survivor had told the stories to detectives of instances where he had violated them. If you listen to the prosecution, this is a story of a young man who was dedicated to his community, volunteered in his community, and helped out anybody who needed help. Well, a Dane County Circuit Court jury believed he did not help that young woman that night, and in fact convicted him of sexual assault and sent him to prison. So as we look at this topic of male socialization and violence, I'm looking at this from a context of all the way from the playground to adulthood, and I'm asking myself, what am I doing as a parent to somehow educate my children that violence is not the answer no matter what? And I don't know whether I'm doing the right thing on that. I don't know whether I'm doing the right job on that. We had a rule in our house that from the time if there's any physical altercation between kids, no questions are asked, you're in an immediate timeout. Then we'll talk about it after the fact. And yet it still happens. I have an 8-year-old, a 6.5-year-old, and a 5-year-old, and the reaction tends to be violent, mostly from my son. And I don't know why. And I'm hoping I can learn a little bit from this panel, which has been the benefit of being a panelist here this week. That's kind of the greatest thing, is to listen to what other experts in the field have to say, and I shouldn't have put myself in that, because I'm certainly not an expert when it comes to male socialization and or violence. But I'm looking forward to the questions that you may have, and I apologize if this was somewhat tangential and random in thought, but these were the ideas and the stories that came to my mind when I heard about this topic. Thank you.
Well, I think that that was a really great introduction to this topic. I think that I'm going to talk a little bit more, not about how men are socialized, but more what is the impact of that, particularly with regards to violence and violence against women. My experience is with helping sexual assault survivors on college campuses throughout the country. So I went to UC Berkeley, was sexually assaulted my first year there, and I think that a lot of the characteristics that my perpetrator had can kind of be informative into how men are socialized into behaving this way. So I'll start by telling my story a little bit. So I moved to California from Massachusetts, and I really wanted to go to Berkeley because it was this progressive school. It seemed like my dream school. I really wanted to go there. And I joined a student organization my second semester there, and the first event that we went on, and so I was completely new. The first event that we went on, one of the leaders of the student organization sexually assaulted me. And so that was a little bit indicative and representative, actually, of some of the most common behaviors of perpetrators. So, for instance, that they will actually target people who they believe to be more vulnerable, and that people who are going to be less likely to be believed, particularly ones who are new to a situation, don't have as much social stature, are the kinds of people that many times they'll go after. And actually, we saw this in the case with Daniel Holtzclaw, who was a police officer in Oklahoma who was systemically raping and sexually assaulting black women. And that is essentially the theory behind this is that women of color are less likely to be believed, and that's why he was targeting them. And that as a police officer, he had this kind of status and power that enabled him to do that. So we saw similar characteristics with my perpetrator, where essentially I was this very new person and he was a leader in the club, and so he decided to target me, and it turned out that he was a serial perpetrator who was doing this to other women who were new in the club as well. So we eventually went to Berkeley about this. They did next to nothing. They said, essentially, you're put on disciplinary probation, so if you do this a fifth time, then maybe we'll take it seriously. So now he goes to a very prestigious law school, which is very close to my house in Massachusetts. So I bring this up because I think it's really important to recognize the kinds of behaviors that perpetrators are often exhibiting that might conflict with what we're normally thinking of when we think of rape and sexual assault. So there are a lot of myths that really stand out in our society about who perpetrators are, and that really influences whether or not we're going to believe survivors who come forward. So, for example, there's this conception that people are only sexually assaulted by strangers, and that if you're walking home late at night, that's when you're at the greatest risk. Well, in fact, 90% of people are 90% of perpetrators are people who know the person that they're sexually assaulting. And so actually, perpetrators of sexual assault are oftentimes the normal nice guys, and they might not even think that what they're doing is sexual violence. So for example, when research is being conducted on perpetrator behavior to try and find out these kinds of things, how they're acting, oftentimes the researchers will frame the question in such a way that is asking about, well, have you ever taken advantage of someone? Have you ever acted in a violent way? Did you ever push someone? Did you ever coerce someone? Did you ever ask someone multiple times to do something, and even if they said no, you made them do it anyway? Like asking it not in a direct way of, did you ever commit sexual assault, but asking more about the circumstances of the situation to try and actually see whether or not that person would admit to it. And what researchers have found is that oftentimes perpetrators don't think that what that incident was actually sexual assault, and so they're more likely to talk about it because they feel like it's normal. And so actually, it's much more impactful in terms of our prevention efforts to try to focus on the bystanders who enable this type of behavior than to try and convince many men who are serial perpetrators not to commit sexual assault in the first place, because many of them, as we've said before, have been socialized to chase that status and power, which often translates into violating women and trying to objectify women and essentially use them as conquests. There was an example at USC where this was, really stark, I thought, where there was essentially a basement at a fraternity that had pictures of women's breasts on the walls. And so essentially what they were incentivizing the brothers to do was to take photographs of women when they were inebriated at parties. And that, when you had more pictures, then you as a man in that fraternity became more respected. And so I think that is one of the clearest examples that I've heard of how this really does play into creating hostile environments for women and reducing women to objects, and how this often ends up really having a very negative impact in our society. So going back to the myths about sexual violence, so many people think that men cannot be sexually assaulted, that this is a women's issue. But actually, 1 in 6 men will be sexually assaulted before they're 18. And so it's very common across the board. But because of this socialization that women are the only people who are sexually assaulted, and that if you admit as a man to being sexually assaulted, then you're somehow devalued, that really keeps many, many survivors, male survivors, silent. And so I think that we have to think about this, the impact of socializing men to seek power and status by not showing their feelings and by acting powerful and by trying to collect things, money, power, women, whatever, that we have to think about how that impacts not just violence against women, but also how that causes men to not talk about the violence that's inflicted upon themselves. So I think that this will be an interesting discussion going forward, and I will pass it to Rob now.
Thank you very much. Those are very hard presentations to follow. In my experience, socialization is a highly individualized experience. Two people who are subjected to exactly the same stimuli will turn out, entirely different. My primary experience, the first time that I ever really experienced something that's relevant to today's discussion, was back in the early 70s when a young woman colleague of mine and I persuaded our editors at the Chicago Daily News to let us write a series of articles on rape. Now, in the 1970s, and you could go back and look in the Reader's Guide or the New York Times Index, you would not find that word. It simply was not there. Newspapers, the media didn't acknowledge essentially that there was such a thing. If you read the newspapers, you wouldn't know that rape ever occurred. I knew about a rape that occurred. A young woman whom I didn't know was raped in her apartment in a high-rise apartment known as Sandburg, that is part of the Sandburg Village complex in Chicago. And I had just learned of this, and this was the reason that I was prompted to do this series. And one of the things that just amazed me once I got into it was how many women who I would discuss this with had in fact been victims of sexual violence. But I ultimately went to interview the young man who had committed this rape. And he was in a medium security penitentiary known as Vienna in Illinois, and he agreed to talk to me. I was rather amazed. He was soft-spoken, he was polite, he was, not a huge man, And during the course of and he didn't deny at all having committed the rape, and he had in fact pleaded guilty pursuant to a plea agreement. In those days, we had indeterminate sentencing in Illinois, and so you had to go before a pardon board in order to get out. And one of the serious considerations, of course, was expressing remorse for what you had done. And he seemed very interested, and even was going to allow me to use his name to, quote him about how sorry he was about this. But then at one point during this interview, he said something that I found immensely telling. He said, "It's not as if I hurt her." Think of that. What kind of socialization had he experienced that led him to believe that sexually assaulting a woman did not hurt her? Just an amazing, rather amazing kind of an experience. As I said, I think male socialization is a very individualized experience, but for my 5th birthday, the primary present that I got was a pair of boxing gloves. This is part of the male socialization process. We're taught essentially as males that if somebody disrespects you, if some guy calls you a sissy, a particularly appropriate response is to just punch him right in the nose and teach him a lesson. Somehow, most women, girls, are not given that same process. Now, when I got older and I got interested in criminal justice, and of course I became an opponent of capital punishment. And one of the things that I was interested in, of course, primarily was wrongful convictions, because I knew this is the one thing that will drive an abolition movement. And in Illinois, it turned out that ultimately we were able to establish that there had been enough wrongful convictions and that we had come close enough on a number of occasions to executing innocent people that, in fact, that did drive the ultimate abolition, which we achieved in 2011. We no longer have the death penalty in Illinois. But in the process, one of the issues that I wanted to explore is who is on death row. And at that time, after we restored the death penalty in Illinois following Furman versus Georgia in 1972, actually we didn't get our law until 1977, and the first death penalty was imposed in 1978. But between then and 2000, we'd had about 150 men sentenced to death, 5 women in addition to those. That was too many for me to study in the brief time I had to make my case, so I selected every nth one. I just selected 25 at random, and I pulled the trial transcripts, and I read the evidence in aggravation and mitigation that had been submitted during the sentencing phase of the trial. And I was amazed that in 22 of these 25 cases that I looked at, the young men had been the subject of extreme violence in dysfunctional families growing up. Now, of course, we know that there are hundreds of other people who suffered the same kind of abuse and did not ever go out and kill anybody for which they could wind up on death row. But nonetheless, to me, this seemed rather a startling thing to see, that almost to the man, when people who wind up on death row have been the victims of extreme violence during childhood and have grown up in very dysfunctional family situations. But as I said, this is a very individualized experience. I wish I knew what the solution is, but I do know that in our socialization process, there are factors that are far less extreme than being subjected to physical or sexual violence as a child that probably lead to less extreme consequences for adult behavior. I think that that probably goes without saying, and we've had a general recognition in this society of the need, for instance, for early childhood education and what we can do. But we need somehow to intervene in the families earlier and to teach parenting skills. And I'm quite sure if every parent were a parent like Adam, the whole socialization, the whole problem that we have in society would be much less. I only wish I could provide some answers, but I can't. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I come at this as a mom of 2 sons, and I feel I'm successful because they're in college and they've never been arrested. So that's a good place to start. Of course, I love them and think they're marvelous anyway. But, I came at raising my sons from a very heavy-duty feminist perspective, 70s, 80s, where I just was like, okay, we're going to do this differently. We're not going to do this the way that I saw other people raised. But I will say that when I was waiting to get the amnio results. This was back before cell phones, and my husband and I were driving to Boston. We pulled off the road to find a payphone because I had to know. And they told me I was having a boy, and I wept the entire way to Boston. And I think that phone booth was in Delaware. So I just thought, oh my God, what do I know? I was raised with all sisters. I went to a women's college. What do I know about raising boys? Absolutely nothing. I'll never forget, this is a little crude, but when the midwife asked us about circumcision, I looked at my husband and I said, you've got one of those. That's your decision. I got no idea what we should do. Anyway, I think he made a good decision. The boys seemed to be happy. Anyway, so and actually the one thing I really have to say is none of my views represent the Environmental Protection Agency. I am required to say that. I have taken off my government hat. I am now speaking here as me, Francesca Griffo, mother of 2 boys, resident of Bethesda, Maryland, okay? All right, so I cried all the way to Boston. So I was gonna do this differently. So we didn't have TV. I didn't permit any violent toys, absolutely nothing. You may be familiar with those bags of soldiers that you can buy at Kmart or Walmart or whatever. I did buy those, but I sat at night with scissors cutting off all the weapons. So we had a lot of cowboys, like this, but with nothing in their hands. I was very hardcore about all that stuff, but I knew that there was something deeper going on when I turned around once and 2 boys, they're 2 years apart, were sitting at the counter in the kitchen eating their sandwiches, but they had chewed them into the shapes of guns and were going like this at each other. So clearly, there's something here that we're up against. And I thought, okay, all right, you want to do guns? I'm going to teach you about war. And I'm going to teach you about the consequences of violence. So we went to every Revolutionary War site within 100 miles of New York City, which is a lot. But unfortunately, what happened was they became fascinated with cannons and battles. And West Point has a fabulous museum with all these little dioramas of all Caesar's battles and all this stuff. And they just loved that. They would say, Mom, we got to go to West Point today. So that didn't work out so well either. They continued to, what I realized, though, was, a tired boy is a wonderful boy. It's like puppies, right? You just run them till they're exhausted. So I found this wonderful camp that my husband and I nicknamed the Lord of the Flies camp because it's fabulous. It's in Maryland. It's like an overnight camp, but they go by bus early in the morning. And they just did boy stuff all day. And again, if you had told me when I was at Smith College that I would be characterizing anything as boy stuff and girl stuff, I would have knocked you down, right? So I hate to generalize, but I realize there are exceptions. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to be a little bit more generalizing. Anyway, so at that camp, they had sharp objects. They could build fires. They got dirty. They did this thing called butt wrestling, which was they put ropes around 2 kids, and they had to wiggle their butts in order to knock the other kid over by moving the rope. I mean, it was heaven. They sang songs. They got to, pass gas and burp and do all these things. Anyway, it was great, and I think it got a lot of stuff out of their system. So Valley Mill was great. There was a guy, John Fishback, they did Indian arts, so they learned how to burn bowls, and he was a hunter and had a license that he could pick up roadkills. So he had this giant supply of dead deer parts, the sinew and the fur and antlers, everything, bones, the whole 9 yards. But after that, I really was very strict. I took very seriously that if you have a bunch of boys together, nothing good happens after 10 o'clock at night. So we did not have sleepovers, and they were like, Mom, you're the worst, Mom. But, later, and now they tell me, you know what, it was really great, Mom, that we could tell our friends, oh my God, if I do that, my mom will kill me. And I don't think I would have, but I am Sicilian, so there's a small risk. Anyway, so I was very strict, but I still, even in spite of that, I can remember being called the police called my house one night, and they said, oh, we have your son, Aldo. And I said, oh, my God. And I was mad at him at the time because he was being difficult. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? And they said, well, you really ought to come down and get him. And I said, okay, I'll come. But I came, and they had him handcuffed. And I said, excuse me, but what the hell is going on here? And they said, oh, well, they were trespassing. I said, where were they trespassing? He said, in this park. And I said, well, where's the sign that says, there was this tiny little sign that said, you may not be in here after dark. So it was he and 5 of his friends who had come out after a movie and gone into this park and were lying on their backs. Maybe they were smoking a little pot. I don't know. But they were looking at the stars and having a very calm conversation. And I said, okay, first of all, take those handcuffs off. You've got no reason to do this. And I think the reason was my son at that time, and still is, 6'2", 249 pounds, and the cop was about 5'2". So I think he was actually physically scared, even though I don't think my son had physically threatened him. But anyway, he said, well, and I said, well, excuse me, do you have evidence? He said, yeah, here, I have this film canister. And he said, smell that. And I smelled it, and I said, you know what, you take that anywhere you want. It doesn't smell like pot. There's no pot in here. I said, this is the canister. He's a lifeguard. He keeps his money in that, so his money stays dry while he's lifeguarding, and his money stinks, and the canister stinks. I said, you back off. I'm taking my son home. And they just kind of looked at me, and they were like, all right, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. So I got to take him home. But it was a little alarming to see him handcuffed, against a telephone pole. And then, with his brother, later that summer, actually, I got another phone call from the police who said, or actually, no, that's not how it started. Luca came home, and he was all hot and sweaty and had been running. And I was like, wow, you look tired. What are you doing? And he said, oh, I just decided to run home. I said, well, where's Gashan and everybody else? He said, oh, I don't know. I just decided to run home. So I gave him 10 minutes, and I went upstairs, and I said, okay, you want to tell me what's really going on? He said, okay, Mom, we were over in that abandoned lot, which is now condominiums, by the way, filming our zombie movie. And the cops came because somebody reported us for trespassing. And he said, basically, Nathan, who he was with, said, cops, run! He said, so I ran. And he said, I just ran, because the Crescent Trail goes through there. He said, I ran up onto the Crescent Trail. I took off my shirt and wrapped it around my head, and I just jogged home. And the cops I jogged right past the cops, and everything was fine. I said, well, honey, it's not fine. We need to go back, and we need to talk to them, and we need to find out what's going on. And he was like, all right. So we went back, and I get there, and the policeman, and I'm not anti-cop. My father's a judge. My sister's a judge. My family are lawyers. I have many friends, so I don't mean to be anti-police. But I got back there, and the police officer came over, and he said, is this your son? Is he the one that ran? I said, excuse me, sir, back off. We came back. And I said, and first of all, my taxes pay your salary, and you can say good morning before you start litting into me. So the supervisor comes over and says, let me handle this one. And so he said, well, this is what happened, yada, yada. I said, it's really not a big deal if they press charges for trespassing. And we started to leave. And so we took his bike and put it in the car, and I turned around and I said, I can give Geshan a ride home. Geshan being the very brown Sri Lankan child. And they said, no, we can't get a hold of his parents, so we're keeping him here. And he's cleaning out the police car while we do that. I just said, I'm sorry. That's just not okay. I said, Luca, help Geshan, because I thought I'm not going to stop the other. So I said, Nathan, you can't leave either. And Nathan's mom was like, fine. So all 3 of them cleaned out the police car until Geshan's mom could leave her low-paying job as a bagger at the Giant to come and get him. Anyway, so those are just some of the adventures that happen, raising boys. I found that sports and music and all these things that kept them really busy and kind of cultivated other parts of them and gave them outlets were incredibly helpful. I found that, just being tough when I needed to be tough was really important. And I think it's hard. It's very hard because for many years they really preferred their dad, who was a mellow kind of, lovely man. I obviously love him very much, but not the tough one in terms of the disciplinarian. But now I think, at 19 and 21, they sort of have seen that. And I'll just tell you one silly story. My older son did City Year. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that AmeriCorps program. And my younger son actually had spent his junior year in high school in Italy, and he was home, and he was feeling his oats and just being a pain in the neck because he'd been free, and now he was back under madam control over here. And Aldo was yelling at him and saying, because Aldo had been home that year, and I'd helped him with a lot of City Year stuff and science stuff and all the rest, and I overheard this conversation, and he said, Luca, excuse the language, our mom may be batshit crazy, but I have come to learn that she knows shit. And I was like, okay, I can live with that. I can live with that characterization. But just, to close, my older son was home for spring break last week, and I went to work one morning, I came home, and he had dug a hole in the backyard and built a forge. He had taken our vacuum cleaner and was pumping air into it because he found a railroad tie, and he wanted to hammer it into a knife. So even though he's in college and an very successful environmental science and Arabic major, some things just never really leave boys. So I think, just going back to something Adam said about this conditioning, I think, for me, I wasn't conditioned to push for power and success, but, the 70s feminist in me, I'm fairly out there with what I do professionally, and at 3 weeks, I went back to work with both kids. I'm not fond of small things that cry and you don't know what to do with, but I do love children. And I'm really glad I did that. I'm really glad that I did push that envelope the other way. I think that was a key part of their socialization, was because they saw me, in that different role. And that has really helped them to see women in those roles in ways that they might not have otherwise. When all of the sexual assault stuff was really hitting, I told you the story at lunch, I sat them down and I said, look, it's not good enough for you to not engage in this behavior. I'm assuming you're not going to engage in this behavior. My expectation of you is that you stop it when you see it. Because, that's just how it is. And I was really thrilled when Aldo called me about not thrilled, unhappy about the situation, but thrilled that he called halfway through the first semester of his freshman year and said, Jesus, Mom, I can't believe it. But you were right. I just pulled a guy off a drunk girl. I just can't believe this stuff happens. So they have really strong, tough girlfriends, which is great. And that incident leads me to believe that, I think we do have enormous influence on our boys as parents. And I think we have to have the courage, to really, actively engage and really make sure that we do talk to them. It may seem like they're not listening, but I'm amazed at what they actually heard all those years. And I think that's the message is, we have a big responsibility as parents of boys. And I didn't realize it when I cried all the way to Boston. But in fact, the biggest contribution to feminism that I could make was how I raised my sons. Thank you.
Thank you all. Those were really gave a lot of fodder, I think, for discussion. I have a few questions that have come in. I do have the computer. Questions are coming in via text. So if you were holding back because you weren't sure your question was going to come in, you can go ahead. Again, that text number is 37607. Then you'll have to respond with UMC 235. But I do want to point out, if you have a long question or if you preface your question with a short story, I'm not being facetious. Some people have told some very personal things. Your question will be cut off, so please make sure to if you're doing something like that, to send it in 2 or 3 texts, because they do get cut off. There's some kind of text limit. So anyone who has so far sent any kind of background information about themselves, I have not received your question. I've only heard the background information, so please resubmit it. Okay, with that preface, I wanted to first turn to the panel and ask you, if hearing each other's introductory comments, if you have any questions for each other or wanted to kind of build on something that you heard from one another.
You mind? Sophie mentioned it, and then Francesca mentioned it as well, this concept of bystander behavior. There's a nonprofit that we were actually mentioning at lunch the other day called Facing History and Ourselves, which uses the world's tragedies to help teach young people how to be what they call upstanders and not bystanders, to actually highlight cases where people stood up for something rather than stood by while something happened. There's a wonderful poem that's in the Holocaust Museum in Washington that was written by the Reverend Martin Niemöller, who spent the last couple of years of World War II himself in a concentration camp, and you've probably heard it if you haven't associated it with Reverend Niemöller. But it's first they came for the socialists, and I was not a socialist, so I didn't do anything. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I was not a trade unionist, so I didn't do anything. And then they came for the Jews, and I was not a Jew, and I didn't do anything. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to stand up for me. It can be an extremely lonely feeling, standing up while everybody else is sitting down. And yet it can define your life, that one moment. And I don't know how to teach that. I don't know how to model that. I'm trying, and I think that's why those self-help books are ridiculous, by the way. I mean, you can't teach that. I don't know how you teach that if not to try to model it, if not to try to expose a child to it. I don't know. But it's a lot easier to speak about in hypotheticals than it is to actually be at that party, as Francesca's son was, and to have maybe his potential fraternity brothers or his potential dorm mates, I don't want to pick on any particular entity, say, what are you doing? Why are you going to do this to your brother, to your next door neighbor, to your roommate? How are they going to survive societally going forward then? I mean, if they have to have a relationship with that person, how is that going to be going forward? It can be an extremely lonely feeling, being the person standing up when everybody else is sitting down. And I don't want to in any way minimize that. And I think that is, and Sophie talked about it at the panel that we were at the other day, and I can't stress that enough, and I'm glad you brought it up again, this concept of bystander behavior. If we don't like what we're seeing, if we are seeing violence and we are not stepping up to stop it, that's just as much on us as it is on the perpetrator themselves, in my opinion.
If I could add to that, I have had the kind of weird experience so basically I went to this fraternity Greek life conference in Indiana about a month and a half ago, and I'm actually going to another conference sponsored by the same organization this coming weekend in San Diego. And in going into that space, I was really nervous because a lot of the time fraternities have, organized to try to silence survivors. And I was kind of worried about going into that space. But actually, I was pleasantly surprised by what I saw. It was a basically group of 3,000 fraternity and sorority folks from all over the country, and they were leaders within their chapters. And a lot of the questions that came to me when I was doing my presentations was, well, how do I actually intervene in a situation? Like, what are some kinds of tangible things that I can really do? And so I brought up this example of what I did when I was a leader of a club on campus. And just to make it seem like something a little bit more tangible. And so I figure I'll tell that story to you now. So I, in a weird turn of events, eventually became the president of the club that I was assaulted in. And part of that was because my perpetrator was probably going to be the next president, and then he had to leave and all of these things. But in any case, so I felt very strongly that I did not want there to continue to be a culture in this club of impunity for people who sexually harassed and sexually assaulted women, because it had been a problem in the club before my case. And so there was somebody who had engaged in some inappropriate behavior at a party, and so somebody had went and talked to him. But then a couple of weeks later, at another party that wasn't connected to our club, he sexually harassed somebody, and then also almost got into a fight with one of our board members, who is 5'2", and this small girl, and he's significantly taller than she is. And so after that incident happened, and I heard about it, I basically said, you can't be in our club anymore. That's just not behavior that we're going to tolerate. And regardless of whether it had been a board member or just another person who wasn't affiliated with our club, I wanted to make sure that we were sending the message that that kind of behavior is not going to be tolerated in our space. He got very mad at me, called me all sorts of things, whatever. I was hurt by that, but it doesn't matter, because ultimately he left. And so I tell this story because I think sometimes people who I talk to about, should I remove this guy from my organization? I don't really know if that's overreacting and stuff like that. Well, I think that it is certainly different from what the norm is, that typically we try to look the other way when that kind of stuff happens. As a culture, people tend to try and excuse it, even if it happens multiple times. But I think, and I know this is cliche, and I hate cliches, but to really be that kind of change that you want to see is really important. And that's what I was thinking about when I decided to kick this person out of the club. I was thinking, I would not want somebody to remain in this space if that were me who had gone through that experience. And as someone who has had a similar experience that was actually, substantially different and worse, I wanted to make sure that we were sending that message that wouldn't be tolerated.
Okay, there are several folks who have texted in that they were assaulted on CU campus and not believed, and are asking, what solutions do we have for this in terms of male socialization? I know it's a tough one, but.
Well, I think the first thing that I'll say is that I believe you, and it's not your fault, and you're not alone. And I think that we have to start as a culture, as was mentioned before, we have to start by believing, and that all of us, regardless of what gender we are, ought to be doing that in our own lives and our own relationships. So in terms of male socialization, I think socializing people across genders to be respectful of survivor stories and to validate the emotions and validate the experiences and not try to, diminish what happened or to diminish the response of the university, for that matter, that is of utmost importance.
Oops, you need this one.
I would have to wonder, just given my experience within the criminal justice system, whether when sexual assault victims come forward on college campuses and perceive that they are not believed, if that is the actual problem, or is it, from the great musical The Music Man, simply a situation that we do not wish to acknowledge. Frankly, I suspect that that's a larger problem yet, that it is simply, it's not that the victim is not believed, it's that university officials have every incentive to sweep it under the rug? I'm posing that as a question.
Yeah, I think it's both. I think that our society has this image of women not telling the truth about these very, very common experiences, and other people who have experienced this who aren't women also saying that they're not telling the truth about it, or, I think it goes back to this image of who is a perpetrator, and that we expect that the perpetrator is going to be some guy who's hiding in the bushes who jumps out at you when you're walking home, when actually that's really not what happens the overwhelming majority of the time. And so since we have that image of, well, that's who a perpetrator is, nice guys can't be rapists, then that ends up influencing everything else, from whether survivors feel comfortable reporting, whether survivors are retaliated against by the perpetrator and the perpetrator's friends, or by the university. And the university administrators aren't immune from those cultural expectations that perpetrators fit a certain profile that is not the profile of actually what most perpetrators actually look like. So I think it is a mixture of both, because there's certainly that, but then also universities don't have the incentive to acknowledge these cases either. And so there are a lot of interplaying factors. And then one last thing that I would say is that I think part of why why we try not to, or why our culture has systemically silenced this issue and tried not to talk about it, is in part because it is so hard to acknowledge that sexual violence is so systemic in our culture. That's an indictment of us. And so a lot of the time it's easier to just think, oh, well, that can't possibly be happening, because then that forces us to not have to, or that doesn't force us to reflect on our own behavior and how we're propagating this culture.
Let me first say I believe you as well. And then the question that I had when I watched the movie Spotlight, which I think many of us saw, as a reporter, I started going back through my mind, what had I heard in the past that maybe I had discarded simply because it was implausible, had to be untrue, couldn't be accurate. And it really started to, and when you talk about this issue, systemically, and Sophie also mentioned, I think one of the reasons, at least, that I took away from that is because boys, young men, are not seen systemically as being victims of sexual violence. It's considered to be more of a situation where women are the victims. And then I started to think about, well, why are we even differentiating? Why aren't survivors survivors, and why does it matter whether they're men or they're women? And why are we even distinguishing, if you are a victim of a crime, you're a victim of a crime. The court system, Rob, isn't going to look at you any differently whether you're a man or a woman. You're a victim, and you're a survivor.
Oh, yes, it may.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Well, it shouldn't. You could argue it shouldn't.
It
Yeah,
shouldn't,
and I'm
we'll
speaking
agree.
idealistically here. But it certainly leads to all sorts of kind of different thoughts as this subject, as everybody kind of, and I think what's reassuring to me is looking out and seeing a significant crowd for this conversation. Thank you for being here. To me, that's reassuring.
I guess something that I would just piggyback briefly on that to say is that, wait, what did you just say? Now I forgot. Oh no.
It'll come back.
It'll come back, okay.
About the difference in treatment?
Oh yes, okay, so in some states, actually, it's not illegal for men to rape other men. Yeah. So you might get treated differently if you're a male survivor because of that.
Okay, so in addition to Spotlight, if you have not had the opportunity to see The Hunting Ground, I would highly recommend it. It goes into the details of how many students have encountered the university system, and how a group of students has actually helped other survivors navigate that system using whatever means necessary. So I felt like I do need to make that plug. Here's another a question from the text. Can you speak to rape culture and the way popular culture glorifies sexual violence? What role might pornography play in providing damaging models of sex?
Yeah, I recommend, so in addition to The Hunting Ground, I recommend watching Misrepresentation, which is a documentary by Jennifer Siebel Newsom, and another documentary called The Mask You Live In, which is about masculinity, which is also by Jennifer Newsom. So definitely check out those films as well. Pornography is essentially the new sex education in our culture. And I believe I learned that the average age that people start watching pornography is really, really young, in like the 3rd grade. So it's something that is really, really ubiquitous, and oftentimes we're seeing, when guys are watching porn, they're getting that expectation that that's the way that they should be acting in real life. And oftentimes what they're watching is very derogatory towards women and is not prioritizing the women's pleasure at all. It's basically like all about men. And that's really, really problematic, because we don't really have other images that guys can learn from at the same time. And then women also internalize that and feel as though, well, I'm just here as something that's supposed to make him feel great, but I'm just, that's my entire purpose. That's often what I hear from girls and women. And I think that it's really hard to address this issue because I mean, you want to make sure it's because of basically the First Amendment. I think that it's really hard to regulate pornography, because if you do that, then how are you defining? So, for instance, with rape pornography, because that's a thing that people watch very frequently, which is horrifying. Hot Girls Wanted is another documentary about the porn industry that mentions this. It's really hard to watch, but essentially, that there are these images that are being propagated that are really hard to. It's hard to regulate that, because then how are you defining what is how are you going to be defining what rape pornography is? What if there are survivors who actually benefit from participating in or watching rape pornography because they feel like they can take control of their experience in a way that they couldn't before? That's something that I've also heard. So there are all of these complications, but I think that one of the best ways that we can address it is to counter it with education in our schools, and that has to start much earlier than college, because by then, many people have already been engaging in various things. And, I remember middle school, people were talking about like getting to various spaces. Like, it really has to start much, much earlier. And so I think that our conversations about that also shouldn't shy away from discussing the implications of pornography and how we and how that might incentivize people to act in certain ways, and that basically teachers should be talking about this and should be trained to do that.
And parents should be talking about it.
Yeah.
My sons hate it when I talk to them about sex. I mean, they hate it. They just are like, Mom. But you know what? When you're driving and they're in the back seat, it's a great time. Number one, they're captive. Number two, you don't have to make eye contact. And you don't have to talk in explicit, gross terms. You just have to talk about it. Or you go see a movie together, and there's a scene in the movie, and that's a place where you can, jump off from that. What did you think about that scene in that movie? How did I didn't know what, and just have, it's never a normal or a natural conversation, but you can have a conversation. And as I said before, it may not look like they're listening, but they're listening, I think. You're learning
You've
some things.
officially scared me. As if I wasn't scared before.
There are other folks who have also texted that they believe you. And also, there's some folks who've recommended some resources for people who are texting in or people who are not texting in. Moving to End Sexual Assault in Boulder, MESA, is a great organization. You can go to, there's also the Blue Bench in Denver, if you're not from Boulder. So I just wanted to mention those resources for folks. Okay, and there's also several people who have a question for you, in particular, Adam, whether you feel that you raise your son or treat your son differently than you treat your daughters.
We learned very early on that each child is unique and an individual, and what may work, if you will, for one child may not work for another. I remember distinctly, I grew up with 3 older sisters, a professional mother, an aunt who was a women's historian. So when we were told we were having a son, didn't believe them. And then they showed me the picture, and I was like, wow, we really are having a son. I think so when I was growing up, I distinctly remember my parents saying, when one or any of us would complain about something, my parents, and we would say, well, that's not fair. Excuse me, and my parents would say, well, life's not fair. And I remember thinking to myself, what an empty, hollow answer that is. This is when I was sophisticated. So maybe at the time I was thinking, that's ridiculous, that's something else. And then you're placed as a parent into these situations where a child of yours will say, well, that's not fair, and you're so tempted to say, well, life is not fair. Because it isn't. I don't treat my son any different than my daughters when it comes to this topic. The idea that a physical confrontation in the house is going to automatically end up, it's the only zero tolerance rule that we have in the house when it comes to physical violence. Sister hitting sister, sister hitting brother, brother hitting sister, doesn't matter. You're immediately in a timeout. We're not talking about it. We're not going to have the conversation immediately. There is a time where you have to ruminate and think about what you did and why you're on that step. And then we'll have the conversation. So in terms of this topic of violence, no, we don't treat them any differently. And I don't think they should. I feel like that's the right decision. I mean, maybe there's a book out there that'll tell me I shouldn't do it that way. I don't know. But that's how we do it.
Just to the life isn't fair, what I always said was, okay, yeah, your brother got that. What is it that you need that you don't have? Let's talk about that. What is it that you're actually lacking? And that usually just kind of calmed it down. Because, again, there are these moments as a parent when you open your mouth and out comes something your mother said, and you're just like, really? Did I just say that? Oh, my God.
Okay. So can you comment on women being made to feel guilty and or responsible for their own sexual assault?
I guess it's very common to feel like there should have been something that, or like that you should have done something differently, or like if you had just like done something else, then you wouldn't have been assaulted. That's commonly what a lot of survivors will think. I know that's what I thought, and I find it helpful to think about how if you were in that same situation, like say that you were, like, for example, you were at a party and you were inebriated. Well, if that perpetrator hadn't been there, then you would have been fine. So the only person who's at fault for this is the person who did it, because otherwise it wouldn't have happened. But that's oftentimes hard to think about because we have this idea that, well, boys will be boys, that, well, like maybe he either like didn't mean to do it, or, he just had to like satisfy his whatever, like he just had to do that. And that's a common way that will excuse men from behaving this way. It's just that, it's natural of some sort, that it's something that's to be expected, and that, if you didn't want to get into that situation, then, that you should have done something differently. It's something that people think a lot, but I really, really, really push back against it because, it clearly is the fault of the person who did it and nobody else's. I think it's really frustrating that it's so, that it's not just survivors who think this, but also just in general, a lot of the time when survivors will disclose that they've been assaulted, a friend will be like, oh, well, are you sure that's what happened? Like, maybe it was just a misunderstanding. And it's like, no, like, that's not the response that you should have. That's not, it's not a misunderstanding. Again, from research on perpetrators know what they're doing. They're doing it because they want power and control. So I would just say that it's something that people, that survivors have really ingrained in them, and then also that we, as people who may have survivors disclosed to them, should go to great lengths not to blame survivors for what happened, because it really is not their fault.
I just have to say, it's just so sad that these conversations are still happening. I mean, when I go back 45 years, I was in the kitchen at my parents' house. I was always running the kitchen at my mother's gigantic dinner parties, and I'm pulling a tray of hors d'oeuvres out of the oven, and one of their friends grabs my butt. And I whipped around and threw a tray of hot arancini at him, and he went away. But when I told my parents, because he went out and he was covered with stuff, they said, oh my God, Francesca, how could you do that? He's the chairman of the psychology department at X university. And what were you thinking? And I was just like, you can imagine what I said. And again, another just story, my younger sister, when she was in first grade, told her teacher, told the principal, told my parents about a boy who was constantly pulling up her dress. And I distinctly remember my mother saying, oh, honey, he just does that because he likes you. And, Carla, being another tough woman, at one point was so angry and so tired of it that she just whipped around and hit him with her lunchbox and actually broke his nose, and she was suspended from school. So it's very sad to think that in the intervening 45 years that we're still talking about it in these terms.
Yeah, thanks for bringing those up. Because I think that a lot of the issues that were being raised by End Rape on campus are things that people have been fighting for since the 70s, and certainly when I was in college. To broaden the question a little bit, what does the 2016 political campaign say to boys about violence?
Rob?
To me, it pretty clearly says you better vote Democratic. I wonder if I might just ask one question. I'm, as by far the oldest person on this panel, I grew up in an earlier, simpler age. And, I've got to tell you, like, the worst thing that my male classmates ever did to a little girl was dunk her pigtails in the inkwell. We didn't, and when I was in college, I was in a fraternity, and we adhered to the rule that there were no women above the first floor, and we didn't drink in the house because it was forbidden. And in fact, our drinking was pretty much confined to beer. We weren't having these wild chugging contests that are killing students. Has it always been like this, or has this gotten worse as we've gotten? Yeah, that's the question. Well, we have a fundamental disagreement.
Well, I think that what's different now is that more people are talking about it. Many more survivors are coming forward and saying that this happened. It's not necessarily that it was not a problem until like 10 years ago. It's that now people are saying this happened to me, when before there's just been this culture of silence. So I think that's the biggest change, is that now people feel more comfortable speaking out because they're seeing other people speak out. But actually, when I was at Cal, when I was working on filing this federal complaint against Berkeley, I was looking in the archives of our student newspaper, trying to find out, has this been going on for a while? Like, like, I didn't really expect to find anything, but then I ended up finding all of these articles about how Berkeley had been systemically sweeping sexual violence under the rug, how there was a boys will be boys mentality, how the professors were protecting their own, how the institution did not want to risk its reputation as a safe place and as a progressive place, and that, it's as a progressive place, we don't have those kinds of things. That's something that is so unbelievably similar to what we're seeing today on campuses and all over the country. That is the case. And so I ended up reaching out to some of the women who had been quoted in these articles who actually had filed a Title IX complaint against Berkeley in 1979 for basically the same exact things. And so I reached out to them and said, would you write a narrative for our complaint that we're filing almost 40 years later, talking about the systemic deliberate indifference that has existed on this campus? And so they said yes, and now we're friends, and we regularly talk about how horrible it is that this has been going on for such a very, very, very long time. So I think that there might be the appearance of it having gotten worse, but I think that's mainly as a result of more people feeling comfortable talking about it.
And just anecdotally, I can tell you I was a head resident at Smith College in the early 80s, and in that year I dealt with 2 sexual assaults. Fortunately, it was Smith College, it was Northampton, Mass. There were good resources, everybody believed it was actually a very good, not a good thing that it happened, but a good place for it to happen. But I also think that, I just want to expand this out because it's not just campuses. I'm actually on a panel tomorrow, I think, tomorrow on gender discrimination. We have to think about this as issues that, manifest themselves in the workplace. As a female field biologist, horrible things happen at field sites because that's where you are, and and there's no place to go with it and nothing to do with it. So I don't think it's worse. I think it's in my experience in my life, it's been a constant.
Okay. How do we fight blame culture and promote what Adam was referring to as up culture?
I think it's really easy to just sit here and say, I will defend a survivor, a victim, I will stand up against whatever ill I happen to see in society, and then to actually go out and do it. On a couple of panels I've been on earlier this week, I'm fascinated with the concept of ethics right now, and this idea of the Virginia Tech professor who helped kind of crack open the Flint water situation. His name's Mark Edwards, fascinating man. He's a civil engineer professor at Virginia Tech. And he teaches an ethics class at that school which talks about the differences between aspirational ethics and situational ethics. And the aspirational ethics of how we would want ourselves to be. And then the situational ethics of how we really are. Mm-hmm. And the goal, obviously, in life, I would hope, is that the nexus between the two is far more direct than maybe it accurately is. So I think if we're thinking about it, if we're talking about it, if we make it okay to stand up for people, if we make it okay to, and when I say make it okay, that means the more people that are going to do it, there's safety in numbers. To have one person saying that's wrong is one thing. If you have 2, that's better. If you have 5, that's better. Exponentially, the more people that participate in that kind of behavior, the easier it's going to be to conduct that behavior.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, somebody said, I've experienced an orientation at a university where we were compelled to undergo sexual awareness training. It consisted mostly of how women should behave. The question is cut off, but how can we flip this discourse? Because this is a reiteration of the blame discourse that we're talking about. How do we flip this discourse? This goes back to the question about rape culture.
So it's already happening on college campuses. At the University of Wisconsin, the police department there has launched a massive advertising campaign toward young men on campus around the topic of violence. It's not directed toward women on the campus. It's directed toward men, and it's directed toward specifically this idea of you should stop the violence if you happen to see it. So it's promoting this upstander, if you will, kind of behavior. Will it work? They just started this fall, so we'll see. It's an advertising campaign. There are billboards up on campus. There are flyers being passed out. There are television commercials. There's web ads. We'll see. But at least on the campus where I live, that's happening.
I think that there's a lot of variance across the country. There are some schools that have been, there are investigations under Title IX from the Department of Education, and so some schools have been under a little more heat to change the way that they're framing materials. And for schools that haven't had that yet, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are doing any better. So that's one thing that I would bring up, is that just because a school hasn't been targeted by activists, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not that it's doing better. But along those lines, I think that if you see that something upsets you in the way that it's being presented by the university, so for example, I see this all the time, unfortunately, when it's like the campus police department's list of tips or something, and it's basically saying like, always walk outside with friends, don't leave the house past 10 p.m., like don't drink, don't do drugs, stay inside, all of these unrealistic things that again put the onus on people not to get sexually assaulted, instead of telling perpetrators not to sexually assault people, which is what we should be doing. So if you see something like that, one of the things that I've learned over the past couple of years is media attention is basically the only way that many schools will reform, even on a surface level, and then also lawsuits and complaints and things like that. But I've really felt that there's a lot of that external pressure has been the best way to get schools to reform, at least somewhat quickly. And so if you wanted to write, for instance, an op-ed in the student newspaper or in a local newspaper saying that you were disturbed by this, or a letter to the editor or whatever, something like that, and calling on them to change the way that they're wording these things, that can potentially be a way that they will actually be like, oh, that's not good that they're calling us out on that. We probably should change that. So I have seen a great number of op-eds that people have written about these issues, and I'm more than happy to help anybody who would want to do that, just FYI.
Thank you. A couple other resources. Someone mentioned SPAN, S-P-A-N, Safe House Progressive Alliance for Nonviolence. I'm just going to mention self-defense training. Impact Colorado does tremendous work with women in self-defense training. So there are some questions about the biological versus the cultural or social background for sexual violence. I don't know if any of you have any comments about why it is considered to be taboo to talk about biological basis of violence. I don't know if that's anybody's perspective, but that was a question.
The scientist on the panel want to weigh in on that?
No. No, I just don't know anything about it. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm a botanist.
Trees never lie.
How about, does anyone have any thoughts about the relationship between male violence in general and our lack of rites of passage in our society?
One of the things that I did when my younger son was a reluctant reader was form a mother-son book club. And we read books. Every month we would meet at somebody's house and we would sit mother-son, and we would make them sit and be polite and, eat with their knife and fork and the whole night, napkin on the lap, all those things. We figured we'll teach them this at the same time. And then in the beginning, in second grade, they would sit and talk about the book for 10 minutes, and the moms would sit over coffee for 2 hours. And then, later on, by the time it broke up in 8th grade, they were, talking for 45 minutes to an hour about the books. And those women, the boys aren't so much friends anymore, but those women are my best friends. But the reason I bring that up is because we read every coming-of-age boy story there was, I think. I mean, we read everything. And so even if we don't have those coming-of-age rites of passage, I think reading about them helps. I mean, there's a great one called The Single Shard about the kid that has to get the piece of pottery across the mountain in China. There's one about, Farmer Boy and him growing up, Laura Ingalls Wilder, the one that's about a boy. I mean, fortunately, I had an older son who was a voracious reader. So all the other moms had kids this was their oldest, but for me, it was my second child. So I could just say, hey, Aldo, what should we be reading? And we'd go through stuff. But My Side of the Mountain, there's hundreds of them. And I think that really, it's not a perfect substitute, but it's a good one.
Somebody asked, how do you know that it's safe to come forward and who you can trust with your story?
I think that obviously will vary a lot on a case-by-case basis. I think that generally, what comes to my mind first is that the people who have the more training and who are the more connected to this issue directly, the better. So people who work at rape crisis centers, for instance, are a good resource. So you can go to RAIN.org and they will connect you to the nearest rape crisis center. And so they have people who are, working on this full time. That's who I would, that is who I would say that you can trust. But as for other folks in your life, I think that it really varies. I think that it could be good to kind of take cues from how they might respond to these things if you see them talking about it. Or, if there are people who are particularly active on campus on this issue, then potentially trying to talk to them. But I think it is hard to make generalizations as to whether like moms or dads or friends would potentially be people that you can trust. But those are the resources that I would generally recommend.
And actually, can I go back to that earlier question? Because 2 other thoughts just came to me. There also, to say that we don't have those rites of passage, I think there actually are things. There's like Knowles, National Outdoor Leadership School, Outward Bound, those kinds of things. But the other thing that I recall is, my kids went through various stages of obsession with different things, the dinosaurs, knights. But the knight phase was really a great one because we could talk about quests. And what was their quest, and what was their life going to be about, and what was their story going to be about? And I think that, I didn't send them off on rites of passage kinds of quests, but having those conversations about what does it mean to go from being a boy to being a man, were I think, well, they were really interesting to me. Maybe they were interesting to my sons, but I think they were important. And the whole quest notion of you have a purpose. There is something that will get you out of bed, and you don't know what it is now. And even now when they're in college, we talk about that. And I'm like, you know what? Don't worry about it. It will come to you. What your job now is to just be as prepared as you can for when you finally see what it is that's going to be your life's work. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. I just want to ask if any of you, any of the panelists have a last burning share for the folks here listening.
That was mine.
Well, I guess I've been kind of thinking about how to weave this story into this panel in some way, so I guess I'll just close on it. So last night, I was hanging out with some folks here from the conference, and there was this guy who was also at this like restaurant bar place, who basically was probably pretty drunk, who was going around and like hitting on all of the women who were around the table, and just really wouldn't take no for an answer. He kept coming back. And he was dressed nicely. He was like this, average-looking white guy wearing like a nice white shirt and tie, and he was just behaving in,
I was asleep.
he had a black tie. Anyway,
I might need an attorney.
well, anyway, this guy, he was just like, he just kept on coming up to the women and like acting in this really weird way, and then would tell the guys who were there, like, how do I get them to drink? How do I get, my goal tonight is to get these 4 women at this table, each to take a drink from me. That is what my goal is. And then he sat next to me, and I just kind of like ignored him, and he was like, I feel as though I have failed. And, I was just thinking to myself, like, oh my God, like this is so textbook, like what I'm talking about, where these men just, like, not very many men, but some men just feel entitled and feel like that is their like goal in life, to like collect women and to go after women in that way, and that he had the audacity to like say that he felt like he had failed. I say that to you because I think it's important, again, to remember that it really could be the people who don't match that like characteristic idea of like the guy who jumps out at you at the bushes. Eventually, we finally got the bouncer to kick him out, but it took a long time. The bouncer didn't really want to do it. So, really, I think this is something that we're very much still in the works of doing and normalizing that behavior. I mean, what is a bouncer doing if they're not, like monitoring the situation? So I leave that with you both as a reminder of, that this could really be anybody, but then also hopefully that you can take from this that there are opportunities to educate people and to be an upstander in these kinds of situations.
I just want to make one comment, because somebody texted that do not recommend self-defense because that puts the blame on the woman, or puts the onus on the woman to protect herself. What I want to say in response to that is that in this conversation, we've tried to grapple with, I think, this problem of male socialization and violence, and we have not yet come up with a solution. And in the meantime, if taking self-defense makes a woman feel safer, then a woman should do whatever she can to feel safer. And that I don't care if a woman is walking down the middle of Broadway bare naked with $100 bills stuck all over her body. It is not her fault. So nobody is obligated to take physical action to defend themselves, but if it is something that you are interested in, then I know a lot of people who it has helped a lot. But thank you very much for your participation. Thank you to these panelists who've given us a lot to think about. And that ends our panel.
Right, I have to run. I have an adjacent panel.
Ah, you were awesome.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you. It was fun.
What? You know what?